There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, of takeout containers on the coffee table, and the low hum of the city breathing outside your window. They do not announce themselves with trumpets or thunder. They simply slip into the room, settle into the space beside you, and wait for you to notice that the entire landscape of your world has been redrawn, quietly and irrevocably, while you were busy thinking about something else. For me, that moment smelled like sandalwood and rain-damp cotton, and it had the specific, familiar weight of Julian's head resting on my shoulder. His breathing had evened out minutes ago, a soft, rhythmic tide against the shell of my ear, but I knew he was not asleep. Sleep for Julian was a surrender, a complete and total collapse. This was something else. This was a pause, a question asked without words. My apartment had become a curious sort of sanctuary over the past few months, a space defined less by its physical walls and more by the invisible architecture of our unspoken needs. Tonight, the ritual was the same as it had been for weeks. He had arrived with an excuse that was flimsy even by his recent standards, something about needing to borrow a book he had no intention of reading, and had simply stayed. We had eaten, talked about nothing of consequence, and eventually gravitated to the sofa, falling into this configuration as if pulled by a quiet, undeniable gravity. His arm was draped across my stomach, his fingers loosely curled around the hem of my shirt. My own body was a study in stillness, a landscape frozen in place by the sheer, overwhelming weight of a feeling I had spent years learning to ignore. Every point of contact was a starburst of sensation, a tiny, blazing sun on the map of my skin. I was a cartographer of longing, meticulously charting the territory of a world that existed only in the space between us. He shifted then, a small adjustment that sent a tremor through my entire frame. His thumb brushed against my side, a fleeting, almost imperceptible stroke. It was the kind of gesture that could be dismissed as accidental, a reflexive twitch in the borderlands of sleep. But I knew it was not. It was a test, a sounding, sent out into the deep, silent waters between us to see what would echo back. In the soft glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor, I felt a familiar, aching tightness in my chest. It was the terror and the hope, tangled together so tightly I could no longer tell them apart. For so long, I had been the keeper of a quiet, one-sided affection, a secret garden I tended in the most private corners of my mind. But lately, the garden gate had been left ajar, and I had the terrifying, exhilarating suspicion that someone else had been leaving footprints in the soil. He sighed, a soft exhalation of air that was more than just breath. It was a word. It was a plea. And in the profound, waiting silence of my living room, I understood that I was standing on a threshold. I could pretend not to hear it, pretend not to feel the gentle pressure of his hand, and this fragile, beautiful, agonizing thing between us could remain safely undefined. Or I could turn my head, meet his eyes in the dim light, and acknowledge the truth that had been building between us, brick by silent brick. I could let the moment break. Julian and I met in the way that feels almost preordained in retrospect, a collision of orbits that seemed, at the time, like simple chance. It was a sophomore-level art history class, one of those sprawling lecture courses designed to weed out the unserious. I was there because I loved the silent conversation between a brushstroke and a canvas. He was there because, as he later told me, it fit perfectly into a Tuesday through Thursday gap between his computer science labs, and it was rumored to be an easy grade. He was wrong about the grade, but the scheduling quirk gifted me the single most important person in my life. He sat 2 rows ahead of me, a shock of dark hair that was always slightly untamed, and he had a habit of tapping his pen against his notebook in a rhythm that I, a student of patterns, found inexplicably compelling. He was bright in a way that had nothing to do with the fluorescent lights of the lecture hall. He seemed to radiate his own energy, a low, confident hum that drew people in. He was surrounded by a rotating cast of friends, mostly other athletes from the swim team, all broad shoulders and easy laughter. I, by contrast, was an island. I was a photographer, even then. I lived my life through a lens, more comfortable observing the world than participating in it. I found solace in the darkroom, in the alchemical process of watching an image emerge from nothing, a memory given form and substance. Our first conversation was an accident. I had stayed late after class to ask the professor a question about chiaroscuro and Caravaggio's work, and as I was leaving, I saw him struggling with a vending machine in the hallway, cursing at it with a soft, theatrical frustration. He had that focused intensity even then, as if debugging a faulty piece of code. He slammed his palm against the glass, and a bag of pretzels, the object of his desire, remained stubbornly suspended in its metal coil. I remember laughing, a small, involuntary sound. He turned, and his frustration melted away, replaced by a sheepish, disarming grin that seemed to light up the dim, sterile corridor. "It's holding my dinner hostage," he'd said, his voice deeper than I'd expected. I walked over, pointed to the faded instructions near the coin slot, and said, "You have to press the letter first, then the number." He looked at the panel, then back at me, a slow dawn of comprehension on his face. He followed the instructions, and the pretzels dropped with a satisfying thud. He offered me one. I declined, but he kept talking, asking me what I thought of the lecture, if I understood what the professor meant by tenebrism, a word he pronounced with careful, deliberate syllables. And just like that, the space between us, which had once seemed as wide as the lecture hall, collapsed into the few feet of linoleum separating us in that hallway. Our friendship was built in the interstitial spaces of college life. Late-night study sessions in the library where we accomplished very little studying, cheap pizza eaten on the floor of my dorm room, long walks across campus in the autumn when the air was crisp and smelled of decaying leaves and possibility. He was the force of momentum in my life, the one who would drag me out of my darkroom and into the sunlight. I was his anchor, the quiet space where he could land when the pressure of his classes and the relentless demands of competitive swimming became too much. He would talk for hours about algorithms and data structures, and I would listen, fascinated not by the content, which I barely understood, but by the passion in his voice, the way his hands moved as he tried to describe an elegant piece of code. In turn, I would try to explain the magic of capturing light, of freezing a moment in time, and he would look at my photographs with a genuine, unfeigned curiosity, seeing things in them that I had not even intended. He saw the loneliness in my cityscapes, the yearning in a portrait of a stranger. He saw me. It was during one of those late nights, surrounded by the smell of developer fluid and drying paper in my makeshift darkroom, that I realized the nature of my feelings for him had undergone a chemical change. He was sitting on a stool, watching me work, his face illuminated by the soft, eerie red of the safe light. He was talking about a girl on the women's swim team, someone he was thinking of asking out. He spoke of her with a casual, easy admiration, and as I listened, I felt a sharp, unfamiliar pang in my chest, a physical ache that was cold and heavy. It was jealousy, pure and simple, but it was more than that. It was the sudden, terrifying realization that the quiet, comfortable room of our friendship now had a door I desperately wanted to open, a door that led somewhere else entirely. I saw him, really saw him, in that moment. The way the red light carved shadows under his cheekbones, the intensity in his dark eyes, the small scar above his eyebrow from a childhood accident. He was not just my friend. He was beautiful. The thought was so clear, so undeniable, that it felt like a physical blow. I dropped a pair of tongs with a clatter, splashing chemical onto the floor. He jumped up, instantly concerned. "Leo, you okay?" I remember nodding, my throat too tight to speak, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I told him I was just tired. It was the first of many lies, the first brick in the wall I would build around my heart to protect our friendship, to protect myself from the hope that I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, would only lead to ruin. After graduation, our lives diverged and then reconverged. He took a high-powered job as a consultant, a career that sent him ricocheting across the country, living out of sterile hotel rooms and navigating the sterile landscapes of corporate boardrooms. I stayed in the city, building a life as a freelance photographer, piecing together a living from portraits, editorial work, and the occasional gallery show of my personal projects. We remained a constant in each other's lives, a fixed point in a spinning world. My apartment became his home base, the place he would come to decompress after a long trip. He kept a toothbrush in my bathroom and a change of clothes in my closet. Our friendship was a comfortable, well-worn thing, a piece of architecture we had built together, solid, and dependable. He would date, of course. There was a series of women, bright, ambitious, beautiful women who were, in retrospect, all variations on a theme. I met them all. I was polite, friendly, the supportive best friend. I listened to him talk about them, analyzed their text messages with him, offered advice. Each time, I felt that same cold ache from the darkroom, but I had gotten better at hiding it, at packing it away in a box and shoving it into the attic of my mind. I told myself that his happiness was my own. It was a noble lie, and like most lies, it began to corrode me from the inside out. The shift began subtly, a change in the atmospheric pressure that you feel in your bones before the storm arrives. It started about a year ago. Julian had been dating a woman named Claire for nearly 2 years. It was the most serious he had ever been about anyone. He talked about moving in with her, about a future that for the first time seemed to include a permanent +1. I was bracing myself for the inevitable, for the day when my role as his primary anchor would be officially transferred. I was practicing the right words, the right smile. And then, it all fell apart. It was not a dramatic, explosive breakup, but a slow, quiet erosion. He was traveling more than ever, working on a massive, high-stakes project that was consuming him. Claire, an architect with her own demanding career, grew tired of the canceled dates, the late-night calls, the feeling of being a secondary priority. The breakup, when it came, was quiet, civil, and utterly devastating for him. He did not tell me about it for a week. He showed up at my door on a rainy Thursday night, looking like a ship that had been battered by a storm. His suit was rumpled, his hair was damp, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and endless stress. He did not say anything at first, just walked past me into the living room and collapsed onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. I did not need to ask what was wrong. The silence in the room was heavy with it. I made him a cup of tea, the way I always did, and sat in the armchair opposite him, giving him the space to speak when he was ready. He finally looked up, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "It's over," he said, his voice rough. "Claire and I. It's done." He explained it all in a flat, emotionless monotone. The arguments, the silences, the final, sad conversation where they both admitted it was not working. He was not just mourning the loss of the relationship. He was reeling from the failure. Julian, who had built his life and career on logic, on finding solutions and achieving success, had encountered a problem he could not fix. And that was the catalyst. That was the moment the tectonic plates of our friendship began to grind against each other, preparing for a seismic shift. In the weeks and months that followed, he began to lean on me in a way he never had before. It was not just about emotional support. It was a deeper, more primal need for presence, for proximity. He started spending most of his non-traveling nights at my place. The flimsy excuses began then. He needed to use my faster internet. His own apartment felt too empty. He wanted my opinion on a new series of photos I was editing. The reasons were transparent, but I never called him on it. I let him have his pretenses, his veils of plausibility. Because beneath the excuses, I saw the truth. He was profoundly lonely. The confident, energetic man who could command a boardroom was adrift, and my quiet, predictable life had become his harbor. And I, the patient lighthouse keeper, could not bring myself to turn him away. I told myself it was what any good friend would do. It was another lie, of course, but this one felt kinder. That was when the new rituals began to form, layering themselves over the old, comfortable patterns of our friendship. The first was the checking in. I have a small studio space in my apartment, a converted second bedroom where I do all my editing. It is my sanctuary, the one place that is entirely mine. I would be in there for hours, lost in the pixels of a photograph, trying to find the perfect balance of light and shadow. The door would usually be slightly ajar, and I started to notice him, standing in the doorway. He would not say anything at first, just lean against the frame, arms crossed, watching me. I would feel his presence before I saw him, a subtle shift in the air. When I would finally look up from my screen, our eyes would meet, and he would smile. It was not his usual wide, easy grin. It was something else, something softer, quieter, a little uncertain. "Just checking on you," he would say, his voice low. Then he would disappear, back into the living room. The first few times it happened, I dismissed it, but it became a pattern. 2, 3, 4 times an evening, he would appear at my door, a silent sentinel. And every time, When I looked up, there was that smile. It was a smile that seemed to be asking a question, and it made my heart do a slow, painful somersault in my chest. I started leaving the door open a little wider. The second ritual, the one that truly began to unravel me, started on the sofa. After his breakup, his exhaustion was bone deep. The project he was on was brutal, demanding 16-hour days and cross-country flights. He would come back to my apartment hollowed out, a ghost in a well-tailored suit. One night, we were watching a movie, or rather, the movie was playing to an audience of one. He was sitting at the other end of the long sofa, but he had started to list sideways, his head nodding with fatigue. Eventually, his head came to rest on my shoulder. He jolted awake for a second, mumbling an apology. "It's okay," I said, my voice sounding impossibly loud in the quiet room. "Get some rest." He relaxed against me, and within minutes, he was asleep, his breathing deep and even. I sat there for over an hour, completely still, my own muscles cramping, terrified of waking him. The weight of him was both a comfort and an agony. It was everything I had ever wanted, offered under a flag of truce, under the guise of exhaustion and friendship. It was a beautiful, exquisite torture. This became the new normal. He stopped apologizing. After a long day, he would simply gravitate towards me on the couch, settling against my side, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He would drape an arm over my lap, or rest his head on my shoulder, and I would pretend it was nothing. I would keep my eyes fixed on the television screen, or on the book in my hands, while every nerve in my body was screaming. I learned the topography of him by heart, the precise way his hair felt against my cheek, the rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of his hand through the fabric of my jeans. My apartment, once my solitary refuge, was now a shared space, a stage for this silent, ambiguous play we were performing. I became a scholar of his smallest gestures. A lingering touch was a line of poetry I would spend hours dissecting. A soft sigh was a novel I would read and reread, searching for hidden meanings. I was living in a state of hyper-awareness, my senses turned up to their highest frequency. The world outside my apartment faded into a dull, muted background. My entire existence had narrowed to the charged space on my sofa, to the silent conversation happening between our bodies. He started to bring pieces of his life into mine, not just his toothbrush and a change of clothes, but small, significant artifacts. A framed photo from a family vacation appeared on my bookshelf. A ridiculous coffee mug he had bought on a business trip to Seattle became my favorite. My apartment was slowly, subtly being remade into our apartment. He would cook for us, filling the space with the smell of garlic and basil, moving around my small kitchen with an easy, unthinking familiarity. He would fix the leaky faucet in my bathroom that I had been ignoring for months. He was weaving himself into the very fabric of my life, stitching his presence into the daily routines that had once been solely mine. And I let him. I watched it happen with a mixture of terror and a deep, blossoming hope that I could not bring myself to prune. Was this just what it looked like when a friendship deepened to the point of quasi-domestication? Or was it something more? I oscillated between these two poles, swinging wildly from the certainty that I was reading too much into everything, to the equally powerful certainty that something profound and unspoken was growing between us. The smile was the most confusing part. The smile in the doorway of my studio. It was a constant. It was gentle, almost tender, and it held a warmth that seemed to go beyond simple friendship. It was the smile of someone watching a thing they cherished. One afternoon, I was working on a particularly difficult edit, wrestling with the color grading on a portrait. I was frustrated, hunched over my desk, running a hand through my hair. I felt his presence and looked up. He was there, leaning against the doorframe, that soft smile on his face. But this time, his eyes were different. They were not just watching me, they were studying me. There was an intensity in his gaze, a flicker of something I could not name. It looked like longing. The thought was so audacious that I immediately dismissed it. It was a projection, a figment of my own wishful thinking. I gave him a weak smile in return and turned back to my screen, my heart pounding a frantic, irregular rhythm. But the image of his expression was burned onto the back of my eyelids. It was a photograph I had not taken with my camera, but with my heart, and I knew I would spend the rest of the night developing it in the darkroom of my mind, trying to understand what I had seen. The tension between us was becoming a physical presence in the room, a third entity that sat with us on the sofa, that stood between us and the kitchen. It was in the way we were careful not to brush against each other in the hallway, and in the way our eyes would sometimes meet across the room and hold for a fraction of a second too long. It was a high-tension wire, humming with an invisible current. I felt like I was holding my breath all the time, waiting for something to snap. I was so attuned to him, so focused on interpreting the subtle signals he was sending out, that my own life began to feel blurry and out of focus. My work suffered. I would stare at a photograph for an hour, my mind not on the composition or the light, but on the memory of Julian's fingers brushing against mine as he handed me a coffee cup that morning. I was living in a state of suspended animation, trapped in the amber of this beautiful, agonizing uncertainty. And then there were the nights he would talk. After the exhaustion had settled, but before sleep took him, he would sometimes enter a state of quiet, unguarded honesty. Lying there on the sofa, his head on my chest, he would talk about his work, about the hollowness of it, the constant pressure to perform. He would talk about his family, about the weight of their expectations. He talked about feeling disconnected, like he was playing a role that someone else had written for him. In those moments, the confident, charismatic Julian I had first met in that lecture hall disappeared, and in his place was someone vulnerable and lost and achingly human. I would just listen, my hand resting on his back, tracing small, soothing circles. I was his confessor, his sanctuary. And I wondered if he knew, if he had any idea, that his every word, his every admission of vulnerability, was drawing me deeper, pulling me further out into a sea where I did not know if I could swim. I was drowning in my love for him, and he was using me as a life raft, completely unaware that he was the storm. The couch became our island, a self-contained world with its own rules and its own climate. Some nights were calm, a gentle lapping of comfortable silence. Other nights were charged, electric with unspoken things. I became an expert in the meteorology of our shared space, able to predict the emotional weather based on the slightest shift in his posture or the tone of his voice. I knew that when he pressed his forehead against my shoulder, it was a sign of deep weariness. I knew that when his fingers drummed restlessly against my leg, his mind was racing with work-related anxieties. And I knew that when he went completely still, his breathing shallow, that he was as aware of the humming tension between us as I was. It was on one of those still, charged nights that the landscape finally, irrevocably, changed. The air in the apartment was thick and heavy, the way it gets before a summer thunderstorm. Rain was lashing against the windows, and the sound seemed to amplify the silence inside. We were on the couch, in our usual formation. Julian's head was on my chest, his arms slung loosely around my waist. The television was on, but the sound was muted, the flickering images on the screen just a distraction from the real drama playing out in the space between us. He had been quiet for a long time, so quiet I thought he might have fallen asleep. But his body was not relaxed. It was coiled, tense. I could feel the subtle thrum of energy coming off him. My own heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm, like a drum signaling an impending battle. I was acutely aware of everything. The scent of his shampoo, the soft scratch of his stubble against the fabric of my t-shirt, the warmth of his breath ghosting across my neck. He lifted his head. The movement was slow, deliberate. He pushed himself up, turning to face me, his knee brushing against mine on the cushion. The space he had occupied against my body now felt cold, a sudden, shocking absence. In the dim, flickering light from the television, his eyes were dark and serious, searching my face for something. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. The wire was about to snap. The silence stretched, thin and taut. It was filled with all the things we had not said for months, for years. It was filled with my secret, hopeless love, and with his confusing, desperate need. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if the words were refusing to form. I could see the struggle in his face, the conflict in his eyes. He looked terrified. And then he spoke. His voice was a whisper, so quiet it was almost carried away by the sound of the rain. Leo. I could only nod, my throat constricted. Would it be okay? He started, his gaze unwavering, locked on mine. He took a breath, a shuddering, uncertain intake of air. Would it be okay if I kissed you? The question hung in the air between us, a fragile, impossible thing. It was not a proposition. It was not a joke. It was a plea. It was a confession. It was the sound of a man standing on the edge of a cliff, asking for permission to jump. In that single, terrifying question, he was laying all of his confusion, all of his unspoken, unexamined feelings at my feet. He was handing me the power to validate them, or to shatter them completely. I could have said no. I could have laughed it off, treated it as a strange, stress-induced anomaly. I could have preserved the comfortable architecture of our friendship, reinforcing the walls that had kept me safe and lonely for so long. But looking at him then, at the raw vulnerability in his eyes, at the way his hand was trembling slightly where it rested on the cushion between us, I knew that safety was no longer what I wanted. I did not answer with words. I could not. I simply leaned forward, closing the small, cavernous distance between us, and pressed my lips to his. It was not a passionate, cinematic kiss. It was hesitant. It was tender. It was a question and an answer all at once. It was the taste of salt and rain and years of unspoken longing. His lips were soft, uncertain at first, and then they responded, a gentle pressure that felt like a surrender. His hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek, and in that simple, reverent touch, I felt the entire foundation of my world shift. The walls I had so carefully constructed around my heart did not just crumble, they dissolved, turning to dust in the face of this staggering, impossible reality. This was not a dream. This was not a projection. This was Julian. And he was kissing me. It was the quietest, most profound cataclysm I had ever experienced. The aftermath was a strange and fragile territory. When the kiss ended, we did not speak. We simply looked at each other, the air crackling with the enormity of what had just happened. He did not pull away. He just searched my face, his expression a tumultuous sea of emotions I could not begin to decipher. Fear, relief, confusion, wonder, they were all there. He eventually rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closing, and let out a long, shaky breath that felt like it had been held for years. We stayed like that for a long time, breathing the same air, our small island on the couch, now feeling like the only solid ground in the universe. The storm outside raged on, but inside, a different kind of storm had just broken, and a fragile, uncertain calm had settled in its wake. He did not go home that night. He slept in my bed, for the first time. We lay on our backs, a careful foot of space between us, not touching, just listening to the sound of each other breathing in the dark. It was the most intimate and terrifying night of my life. The morning after felt like waking up in a foreign country where I did not speak the language. The familiar landscape of my apartment looked different, charged with a new significance. The coffee pot, the sofa, the light filtering through the blinds. It was all the same, and yet fundamentally altered. Julian was quiet. He moved around the kitchen with a tense, deliberate energy, avoiding my gaze. The easy familiarity that had defined our interactions was gone, replaced by a palpable, humming awkwardness. The man who had, just hours before, asked to kiss me with such raw vulnerability was now a stranger in his own skin. He drank his coffee standing up, his back to me, staring out the window at the rain-washed street. The silence was a roaring chasm between us. I wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the distance, but I had no map for this new world. What were the rules now? What were we? He left with a mumbled excuse about an early meeting he had forgotten. He grabbed his bag, gave me a quick, fleeting look that was full of panic, and was gone. The click of the door closing behind him sounded like a gunshot in the quiet apartment. I stood there for a long time, the warmth of my own coffee mug growing cold in my hands. A familiar, icy dread began to creep into my veins. I had misinterpreted everything. The kiss had not been a beginning. It had been a moment of madness, a stress-induced aberration that he now profoundly regretted. The vulnerability I had seen in his eyes had been a temporary mirage, and now the harsh light of day had burned it away, leaving only regret and embarrassment. The beautiful, fragile hope that had bloomed in my chest the night before began to wilt, its petals curling in on themselves, turning brown at the edges. I had let the moment break, and in doing so, I had broken everything. The next few days were a special kind of hell. He did not call. He did not text. My messages to him, carefully crafted to sound casual and unconcerned, went unanswered, sitting in my phone with the cold, gray finality of a single checkmark. The silence from him was a physical weight, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. The apartment, which had so recently felt like a shared sanctuary, now felt cavernous and empty. Every corner held a ghost of him. The indentation his head had left on the sofa cushion, the mug he had used sitting in the dish drainer, the scent of his shampoo lingering in the bathroom. I tried to work, but the photographs on my screen were just meaningless arrangements of color and light. The only image my mind could conjure was his face in the moments before he kissed me, and then his face that morning, shuttered and distant. I had crossed a line, and in doing so, I had not arrived in a new land, but had fallen into a void. I had lost not only the possibility of a future, but the comfort of the past. I had lost my friend. After a week of this agonizing silence, a cold, hard anger began to replace the hurt. It was a slow-burning fury, directed not just at him, but at myself. How could I have been so foolish? How could I have allowed myself to believe that his loneliness and my love were the same thing? But beneath the anger, there was a deeper, more resolute feeling. I could not let it end like this. I could not let years of friendship, and that one, earth-shattering moment of honesty, be erased by fear and silence. He had asked a question, and I had answered. Now he owed me an answer of his own. I deserved more than a ghosting. Our history, our connection, deserved more. I found his location through the app we had shared for years for travel safety, a small digital tether that he had apparently forgotten to sever. He was at his apartment. I put on my shoes, grabbed my keys, and walked out of my apartment, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I was going to his door not as a hopeful lover, but as a friend demanding an explanation. The walk to his building felt like a journey through enemy territory. Every happy couple I passed on the street felt like a personal affront. The city, my city, the place I had documented with my camera for years, felt alien and hostile. When I reached his apartment building, I almost turned back. The fear was a physical thing, a sour taste in my mouth. But the image of his panicked face as he left my apartment propelled me forward. I buzzed his apartment. After a long pause, the lock on the front door buzzed back. He was letting me in. I took the elevator up, my reflection in the polished steel doors looking pale and grim. I knocked on his door, my knuckles rapping a sharp, decisive rhythm. He opened it. He looked terrible. He was still in the clothes he had probably worn to work, his tie loosened, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. He looked like he had not slept in a week. He just stood there, blocking the doorway, his expression a mask of misery. "Julian," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "We need to talk." He did not move. He just stared at me, his jaw tight. "There's nothing to talk about, Leo, nothing to talk about?" The anger flared, hot and sharp. "You kiss me, you sleep in my bed, and then you disappear for a week without a word, and you think there's nothing to talk about? Do you have any idea what that's been like? Do you have any idea how much you hurt me?" The words tumbled out, raw and unfiltered. I had not planned to say them, but they were the truth, and they demanded to be heard. His face crumpled. The mask fell away, and all I saw was a man in an immense amount of pain. "I know," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I am so sorry. I'm so confused. Then let's be confused together." I pushed, stepping forward, forcing him to step back into his apartment. I closed the door behind me. His place was a mess. Takeout containers littered the counter, clothes were draped over chairs. It was the apartment of a man who was coming apart at the seams. "Talk to me, Julian. Please. Don't just shut me out. Whatever this is, whatever you're feeling, just tell me. I can handle it." "The one thing I can't handle is the silence." He finally looked at me, his eyes swimming with a desperate, frantic uncertainty. He sank onto his sofa, the same way he had sunk onto mine so many times, and buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook with a silent, racking sob. I went and sat beside him, not touching him, just waiting. The anger had dissipated, washed away by the sudden, overwhelming sight of his pain. After a long moment, he began to speak, his voice muffled by his hands. He told me that the kiss had felt right, more right than anything had felt in a very long time. He said it was like a key turning in a lock he did not even know was there. But the morning after, the panic had set in. It was a full-blown, world-tilting crisis of identity. "I'm not," he started, his voice choked. I've only ever been with women, Leo. It's all I've ever known. It's who I am. Or who I thought I was." He looked up at me, his face pale, his eyes pleading for understanding. When I kissed you, it was like the entire instruction manual for my life was suddenly written in a language I couldn't read. It terrified me. It still terrifies me. He confessed that for months, he had been feeling a pull towards me that he could not explain and had actively tried to ignore. He had told himself it was just friendship, just the stress, just the loneliness. He had sought comfort in my presence, using me as an anchor, without ever stopping to examine the nature of the rope. The smile in the doorway, the need to be near me on the couch, it was all real. It was an unconscious, magnetic pull he had refused to acknowledge. The kiss was the moment the subconscious broke through to the surface, and he was not prepared for it. He was afraid of what it meant, afraid of what people would think, afraid of losing the only version of himself he had ever known. And most of all, he was afraid of hurting me, of pulling me into his chaos and breaking the most important friendship he had ever had. His withdrawal was not a rejection of me. It was an act of panicked self-preservation. I listened to it all, every confused, painful, honest word. And as I listened, I understood. His fear was not about me. It was about him. It was the terror of the unknown, the fear of stepping off a map that he had followed his entire life. I finally reached out and placed my hand on his knee. He flinched, but he did not pull away. "Julian," I said softly. "Look at me," he did. "I don't have an instruction manual either. None of us do. We're all just making it up as we go along. And it's okay to be scared. It's okay to be confused. But you don't have to do it alone." I took a breath, gathering all my courage. "I'm in love with you. I think I have been for a very long time. But that doesn't mean you have to have all the answers right now. It doesn't mean you have to put a label on anything. All it means is that I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere. We can figure this out. Together. Or we can go back to being friends. Whatever you need. But you have to talk to me. You can't just disappear." Tears welled in his eyes and spilled down his cheeks. "I don't want to go back," he whispered. The words were so quiet, so fragile, but they were the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. "I don't know what I want. But I know I don't want to go back." That conversation was not a magic cure. It did not instantly resolve his fears or erase his confusion. But it was a beginning. It was the first honest step onto a new, uncertain path. We spent the rest of that evening talking, really talking, for the first time without the buffer of unspoken things. He asked me when I had known about my feelings. I told him about the night in the darkroom, about the years of quiet affection. He listened, his expression a mixture of awe and regret. He told me about the profound emptiness he had felt in his life, even when he was in relationships, a sense that something fundamental was missing. He admitted that the times he felt most himself, most at peace, were the quiet nights spent on my sofa. We did not solve everything, but we opened a door. We agreed to take it slow, to give him the space to navigate his own internal landscape. The only promise we made was the promise of honesty. No more silence. No more assumptions. The days that followed were a delicate, careful dance. He started staying at my place again, but the dynamic had changed. The ambiguity was gone, replaced by a tender, cautious intentionality. The couch ritual returned, but it was different now. When he rested his head on my shoulder, it was not a gesture of plausible deniability. It was a conscious choice. It was an acknowledgement. We would hold hands while watching a movie, his fingers intertwined with mine, and the simple, quiet act felt more profound than any grand romantic gesture. We were learning a new language together, one made up of small touches and shared glances. He was still scared. I could see it in his eyes sometimes, a flicker of the old panic. But he did not run. He stayed. He would look at me, take a deep breath, and squeeze my hand, a silent reassurance to both of us that he was choosing to be here, in this uncertain space, with me. The checks-in at my studio door continued, but they were different, too. He would still appear, leaning against the frame. But now, when I looked up, the smile was not just soft, it was knowing. It was a shared secret. Sometimes he would come in and stand behind me, resting his hands on my shoulders, watching me edit. He would ask questions about my work, about the stories behind the faces in my portraits. He was not just seeking my presence anymore. He was actively trying to understand my world, to see through my lens. One afternoon, he pointed to a portrait I had taken of a stranger on the subway, a man with a tired, lonely expression. "That's how I felt," he said quietly, his chin resting on my shoulder. Before, like I was in a crowded room, but completely alone, I turned in my chair to look at him, and he leaned down and kissed me, a soft, sure kiss, right there in the heart of my sanctuary. It was a kiss that said, "I see you. I'm trying to understand. I'm here." We began to build a new kind of domesticity, one brick of honesty at a time. We cooked together, our bodies brushing against each other in the small kitchen without the old, anxious choreography of avoidance. We went for long walks, talking about everything and nothing. He was slowly, carefully, introducing the idea of us to himself. He was rewriting his own instruction manual, page by page. There were still hard moments. One evening, he got a call from his mother, and I heard him on the phone, talking about work, about the weather, his voice the familiar, confident tone of the man he had always been to the world. When he hung up, he looked at me with a haunted expression. The weight of a lifetime of expectations, his own and others, was a heavy burden. I did not say anything. I just went to him, wrapped my arms around him, and held him until the tension in his shoulders began to ease. I was still his harbor, but now he knew he was not just a ship passing through. He was home. A few months after that first, terrifying, wonderful kiss, we were lying in bed on a Sunday morning. The light was soft, filtering through the blinds, painting stripes across the sheets. He was tracing patterns on my arm with his finger, a comfortable, rhythmic gesture. He had been quiet for a while, and I could feel him thinking. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked, his voice low. "Miss what?" "The way it was before," he said. "When it was just easy. When we were just friends." I thought about it for a moment. I thought about the years of safe, uncomplicated friendship. I thought about the quiet ache of my one-sided love, a pain that had become so familiar it was almost a comfort. I thought about the safety of the walls I had built. Then I looked at him, at the man beside me, his hair a mess from sleep, his face soft and unguarded in the morning light. I looked at our hands, intertwined on the blanket between us. I thought about the feeling of his forehead resting against mine, of his whispered confessions, of the profound, terrifying, beautiful journey we were on together. "No," I said, my voice thick with a truth so deep it felt like it was coming from the very center of my being. "I wouldn't go back for anything." He smiled then, a real smile, wide and free of the old uncertainty. It was a smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. He leaned over and kissed me, a long, slow kiss that tasted of coffee and the promise of a future. It was not a question anymore. It was a statement. It was a fact. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. The empty spaces in his life and the secret, walled-off spaces in mine were slowly being filled, not with noise or with answers, but with a quiet, steady presence. We were two different landscapes, his once defined by rigid structures and clear paths, mine by shadow and quiet observation. And now, the borders were dissolving. We were becoming a new geography, a shared territory mapped out not by logic or by habit, but by the slow, gentle, and undeniable pull of love. The door to my studio was no longer left ajar in hope or uncertainty. Sometimes it was wide open, an invitation. Other times, he was already inside, waiting for me. And sometimes, we would close it together, shutting out the rest of the world, content to be lost and found in the small, perfect universe we were building just for us.